A man stood atop a mountain of bodies, his silhouette sharp against the storm. Choked sky blood soaked the battlefield below, rivers of crimson running through shattered earth and broken steel. The air reeked of death, but he remained undisturbed. His golden eyes fixed on the heavens above, he declared that he had slain kings, shattered empires, and crushed the so-called chosen ones beneath his heel, asserting that no one was left to stop him. Even the celestial beings had failed to prevent his rise, and now there was nowhere for the heavens to hide from him. His voice reverberated through the vast emptiness as he mocked the very heaven that dared to stand in his way. Lightning crackled across the sky, illuminating the torn battlefield in blinding light. Sky rumbled in anger, but he laughed deeply, mocking the fury. He claimed that the wrath of the heavens meant nothing to him, that he had surpassed all who came before, and that not even the laws of the world could bind him. He vowed that the heavens would not keep him from godhood, spreading his arms wide. His majestic aura dwarfed the river of blood behind him. Yet, the heavens did not respond. Instead, a blinding golden radiance formed above, coalescing into an unbreakable barrier of divine power as the gates of heaven closed, denying him entry. His smile vanished as he accused the heavens of daring to deny him after all he had conquered. His voice turned into a snarl, but the sky answered only with silence, delivering an absolute and final judgment. He roared that he would tear his way through, unleashing a surge of energy that made the very air tremble. Space cracked under the force of his defiance, and the ground beneath him crumbled, unable to withstand his overwhelming power. Years of grudge and anger fueled his fury, causing the world to tremble. A collision shook the cosmos as mortal land and divine sky trembled in the clash of defiance and rejection. Yet, in that final moment, the celestial forces made their move, wrapping a dark, invisible force around his body. His golden eyes widened as an unnatural sensation gripped him, not pain or destruction, but a pulling and tearing, as his very essence was separated. The heavens were not destroying him, they were casting him out. He snarled in rage as his soul was ripped from his body. The divine chains of fate that had once failed to bind him now dragged him away from his mortal shell. He thundered accusations at the heavens, demanding they face him if they could not defeat him. His perfect, invincible body stood frozen and lifeless as his soul was wrenched away. Even as he was cast out, he vowed that he would rise again and take what was rightfully his. Then all turned to darkness. Armstrong gasped as he jolted awake, his lungs heaving as if he had been drowning moments before. His body, weak, fragile, and unfamiliar, ached with a deep, lingering pain. His trembling limbs barely obeyed as he attempted to push himself up, but he collapsed back onto the bed, panting. He realized this was not his body, nor his power. Memories of the heavens casting him out and tearing him away flooded back instantly. His hands clenched weakly against the thin sheets as he tried to move again, his pride refusing to accept this weakness. A sudden voice interrupted him. A man dressed as a servant hurried to his side, worry etched across his face, warning him not to strain himself because his body was still weak and he must rest. Kyle sneered, rejecting the suggestion. He understood that he had already lost everything and that there was no time to rest. He needed to strengthen himself to challenge the heavens again. Only by tearing them apart would his anger subside. When he tried to move again, pain shot through his body like 1,000 knives. His muscles refused to respond, and his limbs shook uncontrollably. This body was useless, weak, and pathetic. He asked where he was. In a hoarse, unfamiliar voice. The servant hesitated uncertainly before explaining that Kyle was in the Armstrong estate and had been unconscious for days. Kyle stopped listening. The name was foreign to him, and the world around him was different. This was not his realm or battlefield. He had been reborn. A bitter chuckle escaped him, but turned into a harsh cough as his body could not withstand his amusement. The heavens had stripped him of everything: strength, power, status, and reduced him to a broken shell of a noble. Yet they had failed to take his mind and will. That would be their mistake. The servant stepped closer, eyes filled with concern, but Kyle lifted a trembling hand and gripped the man's wrist, holding firm despite his weakness. He demanded to know where he was and insisted on being brought to the oldest person alive there, for he had many questions to ask. His golden eyes gleamed despite his feeble state. The servant hesitated, but Kyle already knew the answer. It did not matter who they were. He would crush them all because he had already conquered one world and a second. Time would be nothing under. So the butler observed from a respectable distance, hands clasped behind his back, though his fingers twitched with impatience as he studied Kyle Armstrong. For the first time in his miserable life, Kyle was sitting still. Kyle's sharp golden eyes were fixed on the old man before him, listening intently as the village elder spoke in his aged, wavering voice. Butler recalled that young Master Kyle had always been an arrogant, insufferable brat, a disgrace to the Armstrong name, born weak and lacking the noble elegance of his bloodline. The boy had thrown tantrums, abused his status, and shamed his house so often that even his own family had largely abandoned him. Yet now, Kyle sat calmly, listening with intense focus focus, the old man rambled about the greatness of the Armstrong lineage, how they were once a force to be reckoned with, warriors whose swords shaped the kingdom's fate. Commanding fear and respect despite the boring talk, Cal showed no boredom or annoyance. The butler had expected him to grow impatient within minutes, interrupt the elder, scoff, or lash out in frustration as he often did when reminded of his inferiority, but none of that happened. Young Master Kyle leaned in, his expression unreadable, fingers interlaced as if deep in thought with every tale of conquest and battle the old man recounted. Kyle's eyes gleamed brighter. The butler watched with growing unease, anticipating an outburst that never came. When the old man finished speaking, an uncomfortable silence settled over the small gathering. The butler prepared to intervene, ready to remind Kyle of the futility of the old man's rambling and perhaps scold the elder for his lengthy discourse. Then, unexpectedly, Kyle stood up, his movements shaky but determined, and bowed slowly and deliberately to the elder. The butler's breath caught. Kyle Armstrong, known for his arrogance and petulance, was bowing to a mere village elder. Butler froze, unable to comprehend the scene. By the time he recovered, Kyle was already walking away, moving at a measured pace due to his weak body. The butler cursed under his breath and hurried to catch up. He called out, barely masking his disbelief, asking what to do about the old man and gesturing to indicate ending the elder's presence. Kyle did not look at him but waved a hand dismissively, instructing him not to bother. The butler nearly stumbled, repeating in shock if Kyle intended to leave the elder unharmed. Kyle's golden eyes flickered with amusement as he glanced at his attendant and asked if the butler had thought he would have the old man silenced. The butler stiffened, realizing that was precisely what he had expected. The Kyle Armstrong he knew was a petty, insecure child who lashed out when reminded of his weaknesses, destroying anything that highlighted his inferiority. Yet now, Kyle had listened to a lecture about his ancestors' greatness without complaint and let the old man live. The butler felt unsettled, unsure whether Kyle had truly changed or if he simply could not understand why. Before the butler could question further, Kyle ordered him to bring a sword. Butler froze mid-step, repeating the request in disbelief. Kyle nodded, eyes forward, stating it was for practice. The butler stared at his young master, recalling that Kyle had never practiced anything in his life, always complaining about his weak body and limitations. The idea of effort from Kyle seemed laughable. Narrowing his eyes, the butler suspected Kyle might plan something foolish, like wildly swinging a sword until collapsing from frustration. Still, he acknowledged the order and promised to fetch a sword immediately, his mind racing to find one dull enough not to harm Kyle yet sharp enough not to insult him. Glancing again at Kyle, the butler sensed something different, something unsettling. He had always considered Kyle a lost cause, a pathetic failure destined for obscurity, but now, for the first time, he saw determination. In his young master's eyes, Kyle watched the butler rush off, his worried expression betraying his thoughts. He sighed softly and rubbed his forehead, reflecting on how he had ended up in this frail, pathetic body. Upon awakening in this broken shell, he recognized the joke his existence had become. His arms were weak, legs barely functional, and his stamina so non-existent that walking too quickly caused chest pain. He had fought the heavens themselves, only to be cast into this state. It was almost funny. Clenching his fist, Kyle felt the feebleness of his fingers and the absence of strength. His once mighty power, the overwhelming force that had made him feared in his past life, was nowhere to be found. He was starting from nothing yet. The heavens had failed to take one thing. He had time to rebuild himself, to grow stronger, to climb back to where he belonged. Exhaling slowly, Kyle curled his lips into a small smirk. Let them underestimate him and think he was still the useless noble they had always known. They would soon learn. This world was just another battlefield, and he had never lost a war. Kyle had never been patient. Waiting for the butler to return with a dulled ceremonial sword was a waste of time. If he was to reclaim his power, he needed to start immediately. His body was weak, his limbs barely muscled, his stamina pitiful, and he was certain a single punch from his past self would shatter this frail form like glass. But that was acceptable. Power was not just strength, it was control and building a foundation, and control was something Kyle had mastered long ago. His golden eyes gleamed as he left the estate halls, making his way toward the private training grounds without waiting for the butler. He moved slowly, pacing his steps and feeling his body. As he walked, his breathing was shallow but manageable, and his fingers twitched with discomfort yet responded. There was no innate power in his veins, not yet, but that did not mean he could not fix that. By the time he reached his private quarters, Kyle had already accepted several unpleasant truths. His body was in horrible condition, muscles atrophied, nerves untrained, and endurance non-existent. This was the body of someone who had lived in absolute indulgence, a noble who had never trained, suffered, or fought. Pathetic. Stepping into the small practice garden adjacent to his chambers, Kyle immediately scoffed. The space was overgrown with weeds, stone pathways cracked, training dummies untouched, and racks of wooden weapons, pristine without a single sign of use. the previous owner of this body, had never trained a single day. Kyle clicked his tongue in irritation, calling it a disgrace that the boy had all the resources and time yet remained. Weak. Was one thing to be born frail, but accepting it without a fight and living in fear of failure was despicable. He despised that type of person. Shaking his head, Kyle muttered that the boy had died without even trying. He felt no sympathy for the former occupant of this body. In his past life, Kyle had been born doomed but fought, bled, and clawed his way to power. This noble heir had everything and wasted it. So be it, this body belonged to him now. Kyle strode to the weapon rack and picked up a wooden sword, frowning at its terrible weight distribution. Top, heavy and unbalanced, it felt more like a toy than a real weapon. Grip was rough and clearly never adjusted for proper use. It was garbage, but it would have to do. Tightening his grip, Kyle exhaled slowly and focused. The first step was to test his innate energy. He had once wielded power beyond mortal comprehension, a force that had brought entire empires to their knees. But this cursed, weak body, could it even handle a fraction of his old strength? Kyle concentrated, attempting to summon a fragment of his former power, channeling it through his fingers into the wooden blade. Suddenly, the sword exploded with a deafening boom, sending splinters flying in all directions and rattling the walls. Instinctively, Kyle threw the shattered remains away to protect his now fragile hand from injury. He assessed the situation with cold disdain, noting that his control had been perfect despite only using a tiny fraction of his strength. Yet, this weakened body could not contain even that small storm of power. Kyle exhaled slowly, acknowledging that rebuilding would require time. As he examined his trembling but unharmed hand, a sharp gasp echoed from the garden entrance. Turning, Kyle saw his butler frozen in the doorway, his face ashen and eyes fixed on the broken sword fragments. Butler had narrowly dodged the flying debris without hesitation. He rushed forward and gripped Kyle's shoulders urgently, warning that someone had attempted to assassinate him and insisting they hide immediately. Kyle regarded the butler with skepticism, questioning the need to hide. The butler's panic intensified as he explained that the explosion was a trap designed to kill Kyle. Kyle raised an eyebrow and challenged the butler's instinct to hide, stepping past him with the assertion that hiding would not save him if someone truly wanted him dead. The butler flinched but followed closely, asking what they should do next. Kyle contemplated his situation. His body remained too weak for combat, yet waiting passively for an ambush was not an option. He resolved to rebuild his foundation by restoring strength, training his body, and adapting to the world's power system, relying on his past knowledge only insofar as his body could handle it. He planned to identify potential threats, whether from within his own family or rival noble houses, and to establish dominance. The fact that the real Kyle Armstrong had been underestimated worked to his advantage, making his eventual rise all the more satisfying. Kyle's golden eyes sharpened as he demanded a real sword. Dismissing the wooden one, the butler, pale and hesitant, complied, handing over the weapon and retreating. Kyle looked skyward, his smirk unwavering though cast aside by the heavens. They had erred. They had failed to destroy him completely. Now he was here, and he was coming back later. Kyle tightened his grip on the sword and practiced slow, deliberate swings on the training grounds. Unlike his past life, where he wielded weapons capable of shattering mountains and moved faster than the eye could follow, his current body burned with exhaustion after mere minutes. His muscles ached, limbs trembled, and frustration mounted. Realizing his body was too weak for intense physical training without injury, Kyle lowered the sword and shifted focus inward. He closed his eyes and sought the dormant energy within. Initially feeling nothing, he soon detected a faint, fragile pulse deep in his core. Smirking, Kyle began to circulate this energy through his muscles, bones, and veins, forcing his body to adapt to the unfamiliar sensation. Hours passed as he maintained deep concentration, channeling his energy to prepare for the challenges ahead. Unnoticed, the butler returned to the garden entrance, shocked to find his young master seated in stillness. Utterly focused, choosing not to disturb him, the butler quietly withdrew. As night fell, Kyle opened his eyes, sensing the faint pulse of energy had strengthened slightly. A small smirk formed. It was a beginning. Just as he prepared to freshen up for dinner, the butler reappeared, this time hesitant. He informed Kyle that the Lord, presumably the father of the body Kyle now inhabited, had requested to dine with him that evening. Kyle noted the butler's tense, concerned expression, which suggested the Lord was not a warm or kind figure. Amused, Kyle shrugged and instructed the butler to lead the way. The butler warned him not to take whatever was said to heart, implying a difficult conversation awaited. Kyle smirked knowingly, anticipating the cliched scenario of a disappointed noble father berating his son. With contempt, he dismissed the warning internally, resolved that the opinion of this man mattered little. Kyle was not here to prove himself to his father. He was here to conquer this world. With resolve, Kyle stepped stepped forward and told the butler not to keep the lord waiting. The butler swallowed nervously and led him onward. Kyle entered the dining hall and immediately grasped his position within the household. The long table designed for nobles was empty. No servants attended him, no attendants stood nearby. He was the first, and the only one expected to arrive first. His sharp gaze swept the room, noting the absence of staff was deliberate. If he held true importance, there would be servants waiting to serve him. He was not respected here, which meant no one saw him as a threat. Reaching for a chair, Kyle paused as his fingers brushed its surface. The legs were crooked, off balance, a childish trick meant to humiliate him. His lips curled into an amused smirk beneath the seat. Hidden in shadows, a thin, sharp blade was positioned to injure his leg if the chair collapsed. The trap was sloppy and designed to mock rather than kill. Kyle trailed his fingers thoughtfully along the edge, then let out a slow breath, pretending not to notice. Suppressed laughter reached his ears from near the entrance, where a small group of armored soldiers stood watching, openly amused. They pictured him falling and making a fool of himself. Kyle smirked, finding the situation more entertaining than expected. Moving silently, Kyle approached the gossiping soldiers from behind. They continued laughing, imagining his humiliation. Without warning, Kyle spoke, asking if they were having fun. The soldiers froze, their laughter abruptly stopping as they turned to face him. For a moment, true fear flickered in their eyes, but they quickly masked it with forced grins and mocking remarks, belittling him as the young master and questioning why he wandered the halls. When one soldier reached to grab Kyle's arm, he immediately pulled away and glared at them. The soldiers hesitated, unsettled by the change in his demeanor. The nervous, weak young master was gone, replaced by a calm, cold figure whose gaze pierced through them. They refused to acknowledge the shift, mocking him further and pretending his seriousness was a joke. Kyle asked directly if they had tampered with his chair. The question caught them off guard. Their eyes flickered with panic before one forced a laugh, denying the accusation. His gaze hardened. Knowing they were lying, he could kill them easily but chose not to. Instead, he stepped forward and issued a final warning, repeating his question. The soldiers exchanged forced smirks but still denied involvement before one could finish mocking him. Kyle grabbed the nearest soldier by the collar and slammed his head into the stone wall. The impact echoed through the hall as blood splattered and the soldier collapsed. Groaning, the laughter vanished, and the remaining soldiers paled, backing away instinctively. Kyle brushed off his sleeve and fixed his cold, indifferent gaze on the others, silently demanding an answer. The soldiers realized this was no longer the fragile young lord they mocked. The scent of blood filled the air as Kyle's hand dripped crimson. Contrasting with the dim torchlight, the soldiers' mockery turned to wariness as they glanced between their fallen comrade and Kyle's unmoved expression. Kyle advanced steadily, stepping over the groaning body, leaving faint red footprints. The soldiers pressed their backs against the cold stone walls, tensing. One stammered, pleading that they were only joking, but Kyle silenced him with a cold glare, questioning if joking justified their incompetence. Soldiers flinched under his weighty words. Another soldier warned Kyle that the lord would arrive soon and urged him to stop. Kyle responded by grabbing that soldier's hair and slamming his skull into the wall, the sound of bone meeting stone echoing through the corridor. The soldier gasped before collapsing next to his unconscious friend. Blood streaking the wall, the final soldier remained frozen, fists clenched but body paralyzed, sweat dripping from his forehead. Kyle turned to him, and though the man braced for the same fate, Kyle stopped and tilted his head, his gaze unreadable. He proposed a choice: sit in the chair prepared for Kyle or join his friends on the ground. The soldier swallowed hard, his mind racing, realizing resistance meant certain defeat. The soldier recognized the figure before him as the same cowardly young master who had always been too weak to lift a sword. Doubt flickered in his mind, but he convinced himself that Kyle was bluffing if he just waited and played along. Surely the young master would return to his senses. So the soldier chose to comply. He said, forcing his voice steady, that he would sit in the chair. Kyle's lips curled slightly as he stepped aside and gestured toward the dining hall. The soldier hesitated but then walked stiffly past Kyle into the room. He reached the chair, paused, and slowly sat down. Tense silence filled the air as Kyle watched from a few steps away. Waiting, the soldier prayed silently. Kyle observed with mild interest as the trembling soldier lowered himself onto the chair, his movements stiff and hesitant. Beads of sweat formed on the man's brow, his breath shallow and body tensed under his full weight. Then crack, the wooden legs of the chair snapped beneath him, sending him crashing to the cold floor. Before he could register what happened, a sharp, searing pain tore through his thigh, cutting flesh and muscle with ruthless precision. For a moment, his body froze, struggling to comprehend the attack. Then the pain hit, and the soldier screamed, twisting on the ground and clutching his leg in panic. His fingers pressed against the deep wound, feeling warm, sticky blood flowing between them, confirming his worst fears. He was losing too much blood, too fast. Kyle remained motionless, his face devoid of emotion. He thought to himself that such pathetic cries eyes were unbefitting a trained soldier, questioning the quality of training in this world. The soldier's body spasmed as he desperately tried and failed to stop the bleeding despite having internal energy. He made no effort to use it. Kyle's voice cut through the silence smoothly and unhurriedly, telling the soldier to keep his balance, but the soldier's legs had gone numb from shock, and his body gave out completely. He collapsed flat on his back, panting like a dying animal. The soldier begged for mercy, his voice breaking as his panic-stricken eyes pleaded with Kyle. Kyle did not move, only watched the shameful display with a blank, unsympathetic gaze. He tilted his head slightly, his piercing eyes void of sympathy, and told the soldier that he should have been more careful. If he didn't want to get hurt, he shouldn't have sat down. He reminded the soldier that he had given him a choice. The soldier whimpered and trembled violently as another wave of pain racked his body, his strength draining. Quickly, he wondered if the young master was possessed by some evil spirit and feared for his life. The blood pooling beneath him grew larger and darker, marking the passage of time. Before the soldier could die, footsteps echoed through the hall, light and controlled, approaching the dining chamber. Kyle's gaze flickered toward the entrance as the large wooden doors creaked open and a young man stepped inside. The newcomer appeared to be in his early 20s, dressed in well-tailored clothing that hinted at high status. He carried himself with elegance and refinement, his sharp aristocratic features and neatly combed hair giving the impression of someone who had never faced hardship. But when his eyes landed on the bloodied scene before him, he froze, his body stiffening and breath hitching. His gaze darted between the unconscious soldiers, the shattered chair, the spreading crimson stain on the floor, and finally rested on Kyle, who looked unfazed and bored for the first time. Hesitation flickered across the young man's face. The injured soldier gasped weakly and tried to lift his head, reaching out with a trembling, bloodied hand toward the newcomer. Soldier croaked, barely above a whisper, calling out, "Young Master Kristen," before his strength gave out completely. Kyle stepped over him, crushing his fingers, which twitched once before going limp, and the soldier's body went limp as well. Kyle exhaled through his nose, his expression bored and almost disappointed. He murmured under his breath that the soldier was already done, remarking that for someone with such a big mouth, he expected better, but those who talk big usually don't last long. Then, as if nothing had happened, Kyle turned his gaze to the young man standing in the doorway. Kristen. Kyle had known who he was the moment he entered, the oldest son of the family, believed by everyone to be the rightful heir of the Armstrong family, the one who would have inherited everything if not for the previous owner of Kyle's body. Kristen remained silent for several seconds, his face pale and expression torn between shock and wariness as he tried to process. Finally, he forced himself to speak hesitantly, asking what was going on and accusing Kyle of causing the incident. Kyle met Kristen's eyes with a completely unreadable expression and replied in a voice neither rushed nor aggressive but carrying undeniable weight that he was simply taking out the trash and questioned whether he had made a mistake. Kristen stood frozen, his eyes flickering between Kyle's calm expression and the bloodied mess on the floor. The longer he stared, the more an uncomfortable thought crept into his mind. The useless fool he had known all his life, the weak, cowardly younger brother who had never fought back, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Kyle stood tall and unshaken, his posture straight and presence imposing. There was no fear, guilt, or remorse in his eyes. It was as if Kyle believed without a doubt he had done nothing wrong. That realization irritated Kristen more than he wanted to admit. A strange, unfamiliar pressure settled in his chest, a sensation he had never experienced before when dealing with Kyle: annoyance and frustration. Buried deep within Kyle was an emotion he refused to acknowledge, a faint, creeping sense of intimidation. Yet, as the eldest son and heir, Kristen refused to be looked down upon, especially by someone he considered as useless. As Kyle swallowing the unease curling in his gut, Kristen straightened his back and forced a stern expression onto his face. He ordered Kyle to take the injured men to be treated immediately and expected an apology from him once they recovered. His tone was firm, though it wavered slightly. Kyle's expression remained unchanged. He tilted his head slightly, studying Kristen with something like amusement, then calmly and indifferently refused. The simplicity and ease of Kyle's refusal took Kristen a moment to process, igniting a spark of anger in his chest. He demanded Kyle repeat himself, clenching his fists as his voice dropped. Kyle met his gaze steadily and repeated his refusal. Kristen snapped, his pride burning at the blatant disrespect. He reminded Kyle that as the eldest son he outranked him and threatened harsh measures if Kyle did not comply. Kyle's lips curved into a smirk and challenged him to act. That response caught Kristen off guard. Uncertainty flashed in his eyes as if he had not expected Kyle to call his bluff. Kyle had already seen through him. Kristen was all bark and no bite. Despite Kristen's clenched fists, tight jaw, and angry posture, Kyle could tell there was no real power behind him. His body was underdeveloped and he had never fought a real battle. Authority without power would not last long, and Kyle knew it would would not be long before he ruled the family. Kyle had already judged the strength of the Armstrong estate soldiers and was unimpressed just as Kristen's anger peaked, and he looked ready to lash out. Kyle's sharp senses detected a new presence entering the room. His head turned toward the door where a group of figures appeared, and his eyes locked on a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence who carried himself like a warrior. Though not impressive by Kyle's standards, the man had a solid foundation. The man's sharp gaze swept the room, taking in the collapsed soldiers, the blood on the floor, and finally his two sons standing amid the chaos. His face remained impassive as he called Kristen's name with authority. Kristen immediately straightened and turned toward their father with a strained expression, bowing slightly before accusing Kyle of causing trouble. Again Lord Armstrong raised a hand, silencing the room instantly. Even the guards instinctively shut their mouths and straightened their postures at the gesture. Kyle noted the real authority their father held, respected enough that people obeyed without hesitation. The Lord then turned to Kyle and calmly demanded an explanation. Kyle met his father's gaze unfazed and shrugged, stating simply that he was just taking out the trash. A flicker of unreadable emotion passed through Lord Armstrong's eyes. Before he could speak, Kristen stepped forward again, red with anger, demanding Kyle admit what he had done once more. Their father raised a hand, silencing everyone. Kyle remained motionless, watching the exchange with faint interest, feeling a small amusement for the first time. Lord Armstrong exhaled slowly and asked Kyle to explain further. Kyle considered his words carefully, then stated that the guards had failed to check their surroundings, made fools of themselves trying to humiliate him, despite being weaklings, and allowed dangerous furniture into the family dining hall. He asked rhetorically if he needed to continue. Kyle's calm, measured voice carried a sharp edge of disdain as he declared that as a son of the family, he was within his rights to discipline them, and that was exactly what he had done. The room fell silent. Kristen looked ready to explode again, but before he could speak, Lord Armstrong raised his hand one final time, shutting everyone up. Silence hung thick after Kyle's words. No one dared question him, as his explanation was unexpected from someone like him. Though blunt and unapologetic, no one had a strong counterargument. The atmosphere grew tense as everyone processed what had just happened. Of course, Kristen had to speak. He burst out, frustrated, demanding if they were really going to let this slide. His gaze darted toward their father, seeking support, insisting that Kyle's actions were unacceptable and that he should be punished. Lord Armstrong did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Kyle, asking if it was truly he who dealt with the guards. Kyle met his father's eyes calmly and confirmed it without hesitation. The Lord shook his head and said there should be a limit to Kyle's jesting. Kyle raised a brow, waiting for elaboration. The Lord sighed, exasperated at having to entertain the conversation further, and warned Kyle not to lie to him again. His voice was firm and final, spoken with such absolute conviction that for a brief second, Kyle almost found it amusing. He realized their father genuinely believed Kyle was incapable of what he had done, not because of lack of evidence or logic, but because he saw Kyle as too weak. Despite facts contradicting that belief, the Lord refused to see the truth. Kyle chuckled softly under his breath, amused by the shallow understanding of his father. Kyle dismissed the world's understanding of mana, strength, and true power as utterly laughable. He asked his father if he did not believe him, his tone edged with amusement. Lord Armstrong shot him a pointed look and declared there was no way Kyle had done what he claimed, regardless of any nonsense he might say, gesturing toward the unconscious men. Kyle tilted his head and smirked wider, challenging his father to fight him to dispel all doubts. The room fell silent. Kristen's eyes widened, the guards stiffened, and even some servants lurking at the edges appeared. Caught off guard by Kyle's boldness, Lord Armstrong's expression hardened as he dismissed the challenge, telling Kyle there was no need for such foolishness and that whatever he was trying to prove was pointless. Kyle cut him off, stating that if there was no point in proving anything, then there was no point in staying either. Rolling his shoulders lazily, he turned toward the door and declared he would have dinner in his own room since he was not needed in the common hall. The finality in his words left no room for argument. Kristen watched Kyle's retreating back with disbelief and outrage, muttering that the young master had lost his mind. Kyle did not respond, but was stopped just as he was about to leave the dining hall by his father's voice calling his name. Without turning around, Kyle acknowledged the call with a slight tilt of his head. Lord Armstrong calmly ordered him to behave and keep presentable because Lady Rose Adam would be visiting soon. Kyle gave no reaction and simply walked out outside the dining hall. Kyle's butler practically sprinted toward him, nearly tripping in his rush to catch up. The butler nervously asked if Kyle was all right and if anything had happened. Kyle raised a hand to stop the panicked ramble and assured him he was fine. After a moment, Kyle asked who Lady Rose Adam was. The butler stiffened, then explained slowly that Lady Rose Adam was Kyle's fiancée from the prestigious Adam family, known for her beauty, intelligence, and grace, and that many noblemen coveted her, but it was Kyle who was engaged to her. Kyle blinked once, prompting the butler to elaborate quickly with reverence about the Atom family's power and Lady Rose's qualities. Kyle remained silent for a moment before responding with a simple, half-hearted, "not interested." The butler nearly stumbled over his feet in shock and sputtered that she was Lady Rose Atom and surely Kyle must care. Kyle flatly replied that he did not care. The butler gaped, looking as if about to faint. Kyle sighed, not entirely without curiosity about this fiancé, but in the grand scheme of things, it did not matter. He had far bigger priorities than some noble engagement, and besides, if Lady Rose Atom was anything like the rest of the nobility he had seen so far, she probably was not worth his time. Kyle returned to his room, already weaving a plan on how to proceed to survive and thrive in this new world. He needed power and fame, power to ensure survival and fame to cement his status so no one would ever underestimate him again. Both were far from his current grasp. He reflected bitterly on the god's effective trap that had left him stuck in his current weak form and resolved to work even harder. Aware that his current body had a terrible reputation for weakness and incompetence, Kyle knew he would have to consistently prove his worth until his new reality was accepted as truth. This meant a lot of work. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, Kyle took a deep breath and focused inward, beginning the process of correcting the mana flow inside his body. He felt the erratic, unstable energy coursing through his veins like a tangled, knotted rope, flowing in the wrong directions and leaking out instead of strengthening him. He thought the previous occupant had not regulated his energy and resolved to force the mana to flow correctly. Slowly and methodically, Kyle redirected and corrected the flow, each adjustment like fixing a broken circuit, strengthening his muscles, nerves, and bones. Hours passed, sweat dripping from his brow, but he did not stop until something clicked. A rush of power surged through him, and for the first time since arriving in this world, Kyle felt a connection to his true self. His powers began to awaken as mana flowed properly through his veins. Though it caused him stabbing pain, he exhaled, feeling lighter and more in tune with himself, sensing progress but needing a proper gauge of his growth. Recalling that in his previous life progress was measured through a system, a physical manifestation guiding development, Kyle decided to create one. Gathering his mana, he concentrated on manifesting an entity to serve as his system. The energy twisted and shifted, condensing into a bright panel of glowing letters floating before him. Kyle's gaze swept over the information displayed. System initialized. Checking body status, body fitness 5%, body awakening 1%, current abilities, mana awakening stage 1, innate ability SSS, grade mana special. Adaptability. Kyle grimaced at the pathetic numbers, noting that even the weakest trainees back in his world had at least 30% fitness at their lowest point. He acknowledged that he had no sword-related skills but took consolation in retaining his innate ability from his past life. He told himself this was just the starting point, closed his eyes, and calmed his emotions. Tomorrow he would wake early and begin training in earnest. There was no time to waste. At dawn, Kyle slipped out of the Armstrong estate and made his way toward the woods, seeking peace and quiet where he could train without disturbance or being spied upon. Back at the Armstrong estate, panic broke out when the servants realized Kyle was gone. The entire household fell into disarray as they questioned where the young master was, noting he never left his room so early. One of the servants insisted they should report Kyle's disappearance to Lord Armstrong immediately, but another warned that if the Lord discovered the young master had gone missing under their watch, they would be severely punished. A secret search effort began with the estate staff desperately trying to locate Kyle before Lord Armstrong or Kristen noticed. Outside the estate, rumors spread rapidly. By midday, whispers circulated through the city questioning the useless Armstrong heir's disappearance, speculating whether he had run away out of shame or if his father had finally disowned him. These rumors eventually reached a small but notorious group of mercenaries known as the Ashen Blades, who were known for targeting weak nobles for ransom. One mercenary mused about the Armstrong brat being missing and no one knowing his whereabouts, calling it a golden opportunity. The leader, a man with a long scar across his jaw, tapped his fingers thoughtfully and pointed out that a noble's child alone and unguarded was an easy target. The group understood the implication. They could capture Kyle, hold him for ransom, or sell him to a rival family for a hefty price. The leader ordered the men to prepare for the hunt. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Kyle stood in a clearing, shirt soaked with sweat and muscles aching from exertion. He sensed his mana flowing better, his body adapting, and his power returning as he prepared for another round of training. He noticed a subtle shift in the air, the presence of unfamiliar people. He lowered his stance and smirked, anticipating the challenge. Kyle stood still, his senses sharp as he detected an erratic, unrefined flow of mana approaching, clearly amateurs. Without turning, he calmly commanded them to come out and face him head on if they wanted to live. The forest was silent for a moment before a low chuckle echoed from the shadows. Several men in dark, weathered clothing stepped forward, weapons glinting, their faces confident. A burly man with a scar on his cheek snorted and questioned why they would listen listen to a noble brat out for a stroll. Kyle responded that they were lucky the leader, a rough-looking man with a jagged blade on his shoulder, raised an eyebrow and asked why. Kyle smirked and declared he was a pacifist. The group burst into laughter, with the leader mocking the idea and pulling out his blade, ready to attack. Kyle quietly chuckled, turned toward a nearby tree, snapped off a thin branch, and held it like a weapon. The laughter died down as the mercenaries exchanged glances, uncertain if Kyle was a fool or more dangerous than he. One man asked what Kyle thought he was doing. Kyle twirled the branch and said he was arming himself to defend against them. The leader sneered and ordered his men to take Kyle down. The ashen blades rushed forward, weapons gleaming for a quick kill. Chaos erupted as Kyle moved with inhuman speed. He struck the nearest attacker's wrist with the branch, causing the man to drop his weapon and cry out. Kyle twisted his body, sidestepping another blade, and brought the branch down on a second man's knee, forcing him to collapse. Before the leader could react, Kyle appeared in front of him and delivered a precise strike that sent the leader staggering back, pain shooting through his arm. Within a minute, the fight was over. Kyle stood among the fallen men, stick resting on his shoulder. Unharmed, the leader knelt, clutching his bleeding arm, shocked and disbelieving that Kyle was not weak or disgraceful. Kyle crouched before the leader and asked why they had attacked him. The leader admitted they sought money, having heard rumors that the Armstrong family's weak son had wandered off, hoping for an easy profit. Kyle noted their plan to kidnap him was not a bad idea. The leader quickly lowered his head, begging for mercy and promising they would not come after him again. Kyle tapped the stick against his palm and asked why he should let the leader live. The leader hesitated. Then desperation took over as he promised to do anything Kyle asked. Kyle instructed him to prove it by cutting off his own arm. A heavy silence fell over the clearing. The remaining ashen blades stiffened in horror. Leader stammered disbelief, but Kyle did not repeat himself. The leader's breathing grew ragged as he looked at his injured arm, realizing refusal meant death. Trembling, he reached for his dagger and severed his own arm. The forest filled with the sound of flesh being cut and a scream. Kyle watched indifferently as the leader collapsed, clutching the bleeding stump. Satisfied, Kyle ordered the remaining ashen blades to take their leader and leave, warning them that if he saw any of them near him again, he would not be so generous. One of the trembling opponents questioned Kyle's earlier claim of being a pacifist. Kyle responded with a bloody smile. Kyle explained that he considered himself a pacifist who preferred to incapacitate others to end conflicts, reasoning that unconscious or dead opponents could not cause trouble. His smile appeared both innocent and dangerous. The mercenaries quickly gathered their wounded leader, hoisting him up before disappearing into the forest, their fear overpowering any desire for revenge. Kyle exhaled and looked down at the bloodied ground, deeming the mercenaries weak and concluding that if they represented the strength of this world, he had nothing to fear. The smirk, he turned away and ventured deeper into the forest to begin his training at the Adam family estate. Lady Rose Adams stormed through the grand marble hallways, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as her crimson and gold embroidered dress fluttered with each furious step. She burst into her father's study without knocking, slamming the heavy oak doors against the walls and startling Lord Adam, who calmly set down his quill and regarded her with an unreadable expression. Rose demanded why he would humiliate her by arranging her engagement to the most foolish and useless nobleman he had ever met. Lord Adam sighed and urged her to calm down, but Rose's fury only intensified. She insisted she was the flower of local high society and deserved better than Kyle Armstrong. After a pause, Lord Adam admitted she was right and explained that he had originally intended to betroth her to Kristen Armstrong, the eldest son of Lord Armstrong, but since Kristen was already engaged, Lord Armstrong had proposed a match with his younger son instead. Because Lord Adam had extended the invitation, he could not reject it without causing offense. Rose clenched her fists and refused to accept the engagement, vowing to make the fool break it off himself before storming out. Ignoring her father's calls back at the Armstrong estate, Kyle stood by his bedroom window, gazing at the sprawling gardens while reflecting on his recent training and growing understanding of mana. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts as the butler entered cautiously to inform him that Lady Rose Adam would be visiting the next day and that Kyle was expected to receive her properly. Kyle reacted with disinterest, blinking at the butler and signaling he would handle the situation when it arose. Butler expressed concern over Kyle's attitude and warned him about Lady Rose's beauty and sharp tongue, but Kyle dismissed the warnings and left the room. The butler sighed, anticipating a difficult day ahead. The following morning, the Armstrong estate bustled with preparations for Lady Rose's arrival. Servants arranged elegant floral displays, brewed fresh tea, and prepared sweets in the grand sitting room. Kyle, however, remained indifferent as he sat alone in the training yard, dressed in simple robes and sweating. From his morning morning exercises when a carriage arrived. Lady Rose stepped out in a lavish emerald dress that complemented her fiery red hair. Her sharp green eyes surveyed the estate with disapproval as she muttered about how unimpressive her future home was. A servant attempted to announce Kyle's readiness, but Rose cut him off, insisting she would find Kyle herself. Rose quickly located Kyle seated on a stone bench near the training grounds, calmly drinking water. She approached and called out his name sharply. Kyle glanced up lazily, his eyes unreadable, and responded with a dry remark about her loudness. Rose crossed her arms, declaring she had no intention of marrying him and refused to be tied to a man known as the disgrace of his family. Kyle raised a brow and told her to leave if she did not want the engagement, insisting no one would stop her. Rose faltered, surprised by his indifference. A strange uncertainty settled in her chest as Kyle resumed drinking his water and observed that she was still there, noting her fingers clenched against her arms. Rose stood frozen in place, her breath caught as Kyle's simple rejection echoed in her mind. Leave, no one's stopping you. This was the exact opposite of what she had expected. She had come confident that Kyle, weak, useless Kyle, would cling to the engagement, beg her to reconsider, or at least put up some kind of fight. Instead, he had brushed her off as if she were nothing more than a passing nuisance. She had not even gotten a chance to reject him herself. Her fingers trembled slightly, pride warring with the shock that kept her rooted. Suddenly, the butler called out to her, snapping her back to reality. The older man with a perpetually worried expression hurried toward her, glancing briefly at Kyle, who had already turned away, disinterested, before looking back at Rose. The butler urged her that this was no place for a refined noblewoman such as herself and offered to escort her inside, advising her not to take young master's words to heart. As he was going through a rough patch, bowing slightly, he guided Rose without resistance. She moved as if in a dream, her thoughts swirling, unable to fully process what had happened. By the time she reached the guest chambers, the weight of embarrassment settled deep in her chest. Her mind kept replaying Kyle's indifferent expression and the way he had dismissed her without hesitation. She had thought herself above him. She still did, but why did it feel like she had been the one humiliated? That evening, the Armstrong family dined together in their opulent hall, the long table adorned with candlelight and fine silverware. Rose sat near the head of the table, beside Kyle's empty seat. Barely touching her food, she felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but kept her gaze fixed downward, unwilling to meet them. Amelia Armstrong, the second-born daughter with golden curls and a cunning glint in her blue eyes, finally broke the silence. She welcomed Rose warmly, stating that her presence would do wonders for correcting Kyle's poor temperament and perhaps finally provide someone who could control him. Rose stiffened at the implication of controlling Kyle like a wild animal, but forced a polite smile and expressed appreciation for Amelia's confidence. Amelia giggled, amused, and remarked that the Armstrong name carried great expectations and that Rose would surely do her best. The conversation churned Rose's stomach. Sitting among Kyle's family, pretending their engagement was still intact when Kyle had already rejected her, was humiliating. Yet her gaze flickered toward the other nobles seated around the table, all influential figures within the Armstrong household. If she played her cards right, she could still gain something from this. Even if the engagement was doomed, staying and fostering connections might prove useful in the long run. So, Rose endured the mental torture, smiling when necessary, speaking only when addressed, and nodding at the right moments, though her pride burned with resentment. As soon as the meal ended, Rose excused herself quickly, eager to retreat to the privacy of her chambers. On her way back, she caught sight of something unusual through the open courtyard. Kyle, alone, training with a sword. Moonlight bathed his figure in silver, highlighting the sharp movements of his blade as he practiced with precise, controlled motions. His shirt clung to his frame, damp with sweat, and his breathing was slow and steady. Rose halted, eyes widening slightly. Kyle was training. She had assumed he was completely worthless, an incompetent fool too weak to be taken seriously. Yet here he was, working tirelessly with intense focus. A strange mixture of curiosity and unease stirred in her chest before shame crept back in. Why was she watching him? Kyle had dismissed her without a second thought. He didn't care about her, and she didn't care about him either. With that thought, Rose quickly turned and hurried to her chambers, unwilling to be drawn into anything concerning Kyle Armstrong. Kyle had sensed Rose's presence the moment she arrived. He could feel her lingering near the courtyard, her energy barely noticeable but still a distraction. He chose to ignore it. She was insignificant to his development. His focus remained on training. He spent hours refining his movements, adjusting to his body's limits, and pushing himself beyond them. His grip on the sword tightened, muscles aching but spirit relentless. Suddenly, a small notification flashed within his mind. Swordsman talent level 1 unlocked. Kyle paused, exhaling slowly as a smirk ghosted over his lips. This was only the beginning, but a crucial step. He felt the shift in his body, the slow but undeniable progress. His techniques were returning, his body responding as it should, and soon soon he would no longer be bound by weakness. Satisfied, he set his sword down and stretched his sore limbs. The air was cool and crisp, with the faint scent of night, blooming flowers lingering in the courtyard. For a moment, Kyle stood enjoying the stillness. Then, without a second glance toward where Rose had been watching, he turned and made his way back to his room. Tomorrow, his true training would begin. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the lingering chill of night as the sun barely crested the horizon. Kyle was already awake before it was time to rise. His mind was naturally inclined to waking early, and even changing bodies had not broken this habit. Inside his private training chamber, Kyle sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, eyes closed as he focused entirely on the mana coursing through his body. Energy was still sluggish, not yet flowing with the natural ease he once commanded, but improving with each controlled breath. He guided the mana along his veins, forcing it into proper circulation. His body, long accustomed to frailty, fought against him, but he persisted. Just as he neared the peak of his meditation, a sharp knock echoed against the chamber doors. Kyle sighed, exhaling excess mana before standing. He commanded the visitor to enter. The door creaked open, and the butler, the elderly man with a perpetually anxious expression, stepped inside. He apologized for the intrusion and informed Kyle that he must come out to bid farewell to his fiancée, Lady Rose. Kyle frowned at the statement fiancée. He corrected the butler, stating he no longer had a fiancée, that Lady Rose had told him to break the engagement and he had agreed. There was nothing more to discuss, and he hoped the butler would not joke like that again in front of him. The butler visibly stiffened and stared at Kyle as if struggling to process what he had just heard. The butler urged Kyle to reconsider, explaining that Lord Armstrong had put great thought into the engagement and that it was not merely a personal matter but a political necessity. He warned that breaking the match could jeopardize Kyle's position in the family and lead to future problems. Kyle, unconcerned, rolled his shoulders and stated he was not interested in tying himself down just because it was deemed necessary. The butler struggled for words, his expression revealing concern not just for the engagement but for Kyle himself. After a moment, Kyle sighed and agreed to see Lady Rose off. The butler visibly relaxed and promised to have fresh clothes prepared. Once dressed in a simple yet elegant black tunic with silver embroidery and his hair neatly tied back, Kyle stepped outside. Lady Rose stood near the carriage with her attendants and turned as he approached, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. It was the first time she had truly looked at him since their engagement was arranged. Though Kyle had been described as sickly and overshadowed by his older brother, the man before her was different, steady, confident. With a sharp, unwavering gaze, she hesitated briefly before regaining her composure. Lifting her chin and crossing her arms to challenge him, she asked if he had finally come to his senses and implied he should apologize and beg her to reconsider the engagement. Kyle raised an eyebrow and asked, "About?" She replied it was about their engagement. Kyle blinked twice, then turned away, saying he was not interested. Rose stared after him, her pride urging her to say something to make him acknowledge her worth, but he walked away as if their conversation had been trivial. A sharp pang of bitterness settled in her chest. She had wanted him to break the engagement, but now that he had, it felt like a loss. Her attendants called her, and she forced herself to move, stepping into the carriage as the horses pulled forward. She did not look back. With Rose gone, Kyle shifted his attention elsewhere. Now that his body had begun to recover, he decided it was time to expand his understanding of the world by visiting the town under his family's rule. His butler asked why he wished to visit the town, assisting him in changing into more casual attire, a deep blue tunic and a dark cloak to blend in. Kyle fastened a belt around his waist, where a simple but well-balanced sword rested. He explained he needed to see how the people in their domain lived, doubting the stability the Armstrong family pretended to have. The butler hesitated and offered a guard to accompany him, but Kyle declined, assuring he would handle anything that happened. Butler, uneasy but unwilling to argue, accepted Kyle's decision. Kyle arrived at the village shortly after midday. The town, situated at the base of the Armstrong estate's hill, bustled with life, merchants calling out their wares, blacksmiths hammering at molten steel, and children darting between the crowds. The scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meat filled the air. Kyle observed everything, noting the market structure, the positioning of the guards, and the expressions of the common folk. Despite the smiles and daily tasks, an undercurrent of tension was evident. Shopkeepers threw wary glances toward armored figures, and workers whispered in hushed tones. Kyle soon spotted the cause. A group of men clad in dark armor stood near the center of the market, their presence thick with authority. They were not his family's guards. Kyle narrowed his eyes, recognizing them as mercenaries, and a very familiar bunch at that.